Good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this Member State briefing on both the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of Congo following my recent visits to both countries. I'm delighted to be accompanied today on either side of me by the permanent representatives of both the Central African Republic and of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. After I have introduced the report and indeed the concerns that I have, focused on the humanitarian needs and what we can do about it, then each of the permanent representatives will be making their contributions, and then without a formal structure of speakers list, we'll have an open floor discussion, and particularly to seek to secure the support that we can to help relieve the suffering that's taking place in these two countries at the present time. So again, very welcome. I shall speak in English. I gather there is French translation happening all the time. So my English is a good deal better than my French. So I hope you'll forgive me for continuing in English. So distinguished ambassadors and representatives of permanent missions here in New York, I deliberately chose to travel to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and to the Central African Republic as part of my very last field visit in my tenure as the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. I leave this post at the end of this month. Each of these countries is facing a critical humanitarian and political crisis that demands our urgent attention. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the complex political and humanitarian crisis is growing every day as the dynamics of violence shift across the country, causing conflict to break out in new areas such as the traditionally peaceful Kasai region. So it is simply not business as usual in the DRC. The truth is that the hideous violence, death, and lack of protection is not confined to the Kivus in eastern DRC anymore, an area which has been bedeviled by violence for decades. The conflict is rapidly spreading across the country and in appalling ways, even in a country which has, as I say, been blighted by violence and insecurity for a long period. The humanitarian and protection of civilians and the situation for them in the 5 provinces that make up the Kasai region is worsening every day, with a devastating upsurge of violence since June this year. Since the conflict began 1 year ago, 1.3 million people have been displaced, most of them internally, but also with a growing number of people fleeing to neighboring Angola. We have reports of 30,000 people who fled to Angola so far. Most of the affected communities have been left with no means of survival. Given the gravity of the situation, on the 9th of June, I declared the Kasai region an OCHA corporate emergency. Other agencies are also in the process of reviewing their internal classification levels. A new report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights warns that violence in the Kasai provinces is taking on an increasingly and disturbing ethnic dimension. Information gathered by a team of UN human rights investigators suggests that some of the violations and abuses committed in the Kasais may amount to crimes under international law. I made it clear in my visit that whoever the perpetrators may be, evidence should be gathered, preserved, and investigations, arrests, and prosecutions should follow. Even more important are the millions who tonight need our help to survive or to be protected. But the primary responsibility is with the Democratic Republic of the Congo's federal and regional governments. Meanwhile, beyond the Kasai region, inter-community clashes in the Tanganyika province is also causing the displacement of thousands more IDPs. I saw with my own eyes how the Moni IDP site in Kalemi had been attacked by a militia, causing its 22,000 people to flee once again in fear of their lives. I saw the fears and the sheer despair in the eyes of the people. All they asked for was security and safety. And in North and South Kivu, where I also traveled, the more traditional hotbeds of humanitarian need, clashes between armed groups continued to cause widespread displacement, leaving millions of people displaced from their homes. We began this year estimating that 1 million additional people would be displaced by conflict this year. Our estimates have been grievously surpassed. Today, the Democratic Republic of the Congo hosts the largest internally displaced population of any country in Africa, with 3.8 million IDPs. Humanitarian needs are staggering. We must invest now to help strengthen the response. These multiple complex emergencies, combined with deep vulnerability and structural fragility, have led to a staggering 7 million people in DRC to need emergency assistance tonight to survive. Some 1.9 million of those in need are children suffering from severe acute malnutrition. Meanwhile, 35 million people in DRC are at risk of epidemic diseases, including malaria, cholera, measles, and yellow fever. The current violence in DRC is marked by horrifying abuses, and today 1.6 million people face protection risk. 600 cases of sexual violence have been reported since last year against women, girls, and boys. In the Komba IDP site in Kasai region, I met a woman, Mangasa Kaloni, who told me how she was almost burned alive as her village was attacked. Children have been separated from their parents at alarming rates. They have been torn away from their occupied or damaged schools and have been forcibly recruited into armed groups. So I have to pose the question to each and every one of us. How many more clues do we need before we act? This mounting protection crisis comes just as the UN stabilization mission in the DRC, the MONUSCO, faces budget cuts, which puts at severe risk the mission's capacity to perform its protection mandate, and which will put more pressure on the UN country team to shoulder this responsibility. I have seen an excellent UN team and a committed HTC and UN and NGOs humanitarian partners, all willing to do their best to ensure that we don't let the people of the DRC down. Funding remains a critical challenge in responding to the crisis in the DRC. The humanitarian funding gap is also growing just as violence mounts. The Interagency Humanitarian Response Plan of US $812.5 million is less than 1/4 funded. We are now in August, well over halfway through this year. So this represents our lowest funding level in a decade in support of the suffering people in DRC. This includes a $64.5 million emergency appeal for the Kasai crisis, which is just 11% funded. Just because the political situation has become more unstable in the DRC, because of the postponed presidential elections, these are unquestionably a driving factor in this staggering increase in violence in DRC. But this is no reason for the resources to not be made available to meet the increased suffering of the DRC people. The humanitarian community is ready to invest its resources to mount a robust response to the Kasai crisis in line with needs, but to do so, we do need these investments, as we are starting operations from scratch there in an area where we have not traditionally operated. So my message is today simple. We simply have no time to lose. Inaction in the Democratic Republic of the Congo will have dramatic consequences for the Congolese people, but also for the stability of the region. I urge you each to act now to stop a critical situation from worsening further. We owe the millions of women, men, girls, and boys of the Democratic Republic of the Congo a humanitarian and a political response that is commensurate to their plight and their will to survive. If I may, I now turn to the Central African Republic. Here, the picture is equally challenging, I'm afraid. Violence is intensifying, risking a repeat of the devastating, destructive crisis that gripped the country 4 years ago. From that terrible situation, the Central African Republic had made relatively tremendous progress over the past 2 years. It has successfully held democratic elections and strengthened governance systems, albeit with a very short reach across the country. Many told me the central government's Many told me that the central government's writ runs only as far as 12 kilometers from the edge of Bangui. However, an upsurge of violence risks eroding these hard-won development gains that have been made. I am extremely alarmed by the increased scale and atrocity of needless and brutal violence in the country since the beginning of 2017, and especially I'm concerned about the resurgence of intercommunal violence, incited by armed groups and predatory politicians, that has broken out in Bangassou, Zemio and Obo in the southeast, as well as the crisis in Bokaranga in the northwest, to name a few. The recent upsurge in violence has added to humanitarian needs in what is already one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world. With 2.4 million people, that's half the total population of the Central African Republic, in need of humanitarian aid to survive, the Central African Republic has the largest population in need per capita. The number of internally displaced people have risen by 40% this year, an increase of some 180,000, bringing the total to well over 500,000, in addition to 500,000 refugees. The protection of civilians is a central concern, with minority groups throughout the country facing discrimination and attacks based on their ethnicity and religion. While I was there, I noted with some degree of encouragement the sparks of progress for children this year, with students at emergency schools passing their elementary exams. But nonetheless, 1 in 3 children in the CAR is still unable to return to school. Bangassou, which staved off violence 4 years ago, has not been able to do so this time. I was shocked and horrified to see the conditions of the 2,000 IDPs that were forced to seek sanctuary in the Catholic Church following the attacks on their villages in May. Today, after 3 months, the site is surrounded by anti-Balaka elements threatening to kill them. The risks are extremely high, and we must be properly focused on whether to relocate them to another site or not, but it's extremely fraught with danger. I went back to see where they had been expelled from because of the terrible violence and had been forced to flee, and there have been further attacks and destructions on their mosque, on all their community activities, but all the houses in their village occupied by Christians were left standing. So that underlines the very nasty ethnic and confessional excuse which is now being used to discriminate and to commit atrocious violence. So time is of the essence. We must be ready to make courageous decisions to uphold humanitarian principles. Bangassou is just one of many disheartening examples of the violence unfolding in the CAR right now. Now, thankfully, we also have in the CAR a very active humanitarian coordinator who is doing her utmost to respond to the crisis in close coordination with the government, the UN Stabilization Mission, CAR, that's MINUSCA, and the humanitarian partners. And let me add that there was a rather despicable tenor of comments that I picked up, that because the contributing MINUSCA troops in Bangassou were Moroccan, Muslim, they were therefore partial and a legitimate enemy by those who wished to use them as a target and to kill them. They've suffered and they've lost lives. We know that nothing could be further from the truth. The Moroccan commander, I met him, and his troops were deeply impressive, they were professional, they were impartial, and despite suffering terrible losses in recent days, they are not a target, and we must defend them, and we must certainly not be pressured as the UN or the international community to remove them from their duties. They must retain our and your full support. We cannot underestimate the dangerous spread of militant groups in CAR, some of which have the clear intention, and I'm going to use this phrase extremely advisedly, but I mean it, to ethnically cleanse. And let me repeat this, and I have now alerted both the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Mr. Zaid, and Mr. Adama Dieng, who has to focus all the UN's concerns about potential genocides. The early warning signs of genocide are there. We must act now, and we must not pare down the UN's effort, and then, if we did, then just pray that we don't live to regret it. I repeat the phrase, how many more clues do we all need? It is all too clear to those of us who've seen it on the ground. It is time to authorise an increase in the troops and police personnel to enable MONUSCO to deliver on its critical protection mandate, and we must act now to contain this crisis. As in the DRC, funding levels do not meet the severity of the crisis. Our actions must include expanding our financial support. Donor engagement in the CAR has declined over the past 3 years, causing chronic underfunding. The 2017 Humanitarian Response Plan was revised upwards to US $497 million, in line with the rising needs, but 8 months into the year, it is only 24% funded. So let me make it clear, if further funding does not come in, humanitarian operations will be interrupted, leaving children without protection, parents without the food to feed them, whole families without access to life-saving health care. And as I've said, the real risk of much, much worse as confessional and ethnic militias rampage through villages, cleansing them of people not of their type, is just around the corner. So I do thank the donors who've supported the pooled funds in both the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Central African Republic, and I encourage all of you to channel support through these funds, which drive an effective, rapid, strategic and localized response. The Central African Republic is at a critical juncture, and we cannot give up now. We must do all that we can to protect the political and development gains that we have invested in over recent years. The risk of relapse into another large-scale humanitarian crisis is imminent. I call on each of you here to step up your efforts for the sake of peace, for the future of the country, and above all, for the future of the people. So I do thank you for being here today and for your interest, and thank you for your support as we work together to deliver a better future for millions of conflict-affected people today and for future generations in both the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But let's remind ourselves, these acute, urgent humanitarian crises, neither of them are natural disasters. They are man-made. It is therefore within our scope as an international community, but above all within the scope of each of the countries, governments and people, to mitigate and ward off the terrible behaviours, attitudes, violent actions, intimidation, and fearful threats. But above all, it needs the UN's protection by presence in sufficient numbers and sufficiently resourced, and with humanitarian relief sufficiently resourced to save lives, which we can do both working with the countries and the governments and the peoples, but by the United Nations and our brave, determined humanitarian INGO and NGO partners. And for that, we need your support and we need your funds. So with that, I thank you very much indeed. I now have the honour of passing the word first to our respective PRs of the two countries concerned. Perhaps I should do them in the order in which I happen to present them, so perhaps I'll start with the permanent representative for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you.
Monsieur le Secrétaire.
Mr. Undersecretary General, I listened with ongoing attention to your briefing on the humanitarian situation in my country. And it appears to me that it would be constructive not to deliver specific remarks on a report which describes facts which you've observed on the ground. I would merely like to limit myself on behalf of the government of my country to thanking you, Mr. Undersecretary General, the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for the initiatives you've undertaken several weeks before the end of your mandate as you visited the Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and particularly with a visit to the Kasai region with a view to seeing with your own eyes the grave humanitarian situation plaguing the people in that part of my country. Mr. Undersecretary General, during your stay in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you held exchanges with the authorities of my country, particularly with the Prime Minister, who spoke to you of the will of the government to adopt the necessary measures to tackle the root causes of the conflict plaguing the Kasai and to restore order and security in the region, while by ending the violence plaguing that part of my country, which triggered mass displacements of people. The Prime Minister also commended and welcomed your commitment and that of your staff alongside the Congolese government in rescuing the many people who were in distress, without resources and without support. He noted a determination to facilitate humanitarian actors' access to the people in that area, several thousand of whom need their support. In this context, the Humanitarian Action Plan, which your staff drafted with the assistance of the Congolese government, in our view, is the best way to deliver assistance to the suffering people who have an urgent need for assistance. For this reason, Mr. Undersecretary General, my government commends and warmly appreciates the appeal you've delivered today among donors, and this is an appeal which occurs at an important juncture. So I take the opportunity afforded me to extend to donors the gratitude of my government and of my people who count upon their great generosity. Beyond the troubling situation in the Kasai region, as you mentioned, the government is also troubled by the eastern part, which remains unstable following the presence of armed groups. There, people are constantly subject to displacement. The protection of people, health, and food security lie at the heart of the priorities of the government. We appreciate the contribution of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and we stand ready to continue working together to deliver assistance to the many people who have an urgent need for such assistance. Thank you, Mr. Undersecretary General.
Votre Excellence, merci bien pour...
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your contribution. And I will now give the floor to Her Excellency, the Permanent Representative of the Central African Republic. Mr. Undersecretary General and Emergency Relief Coordinator, allow me to express my sincere thanks and gratitude for organizing this meeting. To bring us up to speed on your visit to the CAR from the 16th to the 18th of July 2017. And through you, sir, I wish to speak to the CAR, which is beset by the violence that you just described. I'm also grateful for your faithful account of the situation as it is in our country, especially in Bangassou and several other towns. These are scenes of violence that have been besetting the country since the beginning of this year. And I am pleased that you went to Bongi and especially to Bangassou to see the humanitarian situation, which you have characterized as worrisome, which what I would say is tragic. The scale of the seriousness of these events justifies the multiplication of appeals to the international community and the UN in particular to invest further alongside the Central African authorities to find ways and means to emerge from this crisis. Sir, ladies and gentlemen, it is important that we remember that humanitarian aid alone is not enough to address all the aspects of this crisis in the CAR. This assistance is often outstripped by the economic, strategic, and political challenges. And it is for this reason that the international community, through MINUSCA, must bring its pressure to bear. However, when we look at the recent events, we see a huge imbalance between the intelligence and equipment available to the armed forces and those available to the United Nations peacekeeping force. It is the UN's peacekeepers who are suffering because of this imbalance, and it is now up to us to readjust the international legal instruments to protect civilians and bring it up to speed with the realities on the ground in the CAR. Indeed, all calls for protecting civilians have not been heard by the parties to the conflict, and we know all too well the pain of the victims of this unending crisis. I must point out that the many war coalitions and the many warlords coming on the scene and the criminal organizations are now increasing the need for humanitarian action, and it is also making it more difficult for them to operate. This also calls for a robust response from MINUSCA in the absence of a national army, which is still trying to pull its ranks together and is not yet equipped. Mr. USG, I wish to support your appeal for urgent humanitarian assistance from the international community and to scale it up for my country. I cannot fully express the seriousness of the situation on the ground, but your visit has enabled you to pinpoint the realities on the ground, and it is a laudable effort which has moved us. I would like to launch an appeal to the international community to maintain their support that they have always provided to the CAR so as to stave off any further crises. I would wish to thank you for the efforts of yourself and Ms. Najat, the humanitarian coordinator, to visit the country and to provide assistance. And allow me to conclude by saying that you have spoken the truth. If we take no action now, we will see the needs and vulnerability grow of the people who have already been weakened by this crisis. Thank you, sir.
Votre Excellence, je vous remercie. Très bien.
I thank you kindly.
To the floor, very much in the spirit of the huge shared responsibility which now potentially faces us to try and find a way forward for the suffering of the people in both the DRC and CAR. I'm about to make decisions about the next allocations of both the underfunded window and the rapid response windows of the SURF. And I would very much like to be able to do it on a matched basis. So if when you make your contributions, you know that I will be trying to therefore match the SURF to anything you're able to offer. That will help incentivize, I hope, some contributions to effectively double your money. I'll have to put a limit on that, of course, because the surf in the end is also provided by you, and it has only got what it has in the accounts. But let's see if that helps produce some extra support. And I think the other thing to bear in mind as we think about the financial resources required in all respects is we're dealing with, however hard we try to be super efficient and to do it through these planned and clear strategic targeted responses, these are vast territories of very difficult logistical communications. So we should not lose sight of the fact that the DRC is the size of Western Europe. It's got relatively very few roads, a lot of impenetrable forests, limited amount of navigable rivers, which is often the main form of local transport, and where the UN more or less has to operate exclusively by flying between places and transporting in that respect, although there can be some overland transportation, but it takes time and can get very bogged down in the repeat rainy season. There's no shortage of natural resources. The issue is the logistics of getting the right things to people at the right time in order for them to survive. And in the CAR, again, it's about twice the size of France, with, again, very few roads. So the cost of simply being able to deliver life-saving and protection itself is challenged by the very nature of the absence of infrastructure in such vast countries. So with that, it's very much free flow. I see there are a number of hands already showing. Perhaps that's the easiest way to do it, but perhaps we'll start with the permanent representative, the honourable member from Senegal. Thank you.
Mr. Ryan, on behalf of the Senegalese delegation, I too can note on behalf perhaps of my two colleagues, the permanent representatives of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Central African Republic, I too would like to extend our deepest appreciation to you firstly for the fact that you took the initiative to visit these two great African countries at a time when your mandate is drawing to an end. But also and especially, we thank you for having called this meeting, and also for this advocacy to the international community. You certainly followed the Security Council, followed the fact that the Security Council has published two presidential statements on these two great countries. Senegal is one of the three members of the Security Council which actively took part in negotiations on this declaration. These declarations which also show the magnitude of the crisis plaguing these two countries. You also noticed, sir, you noted the sub-regional dimension which our African countries wanted the Security Council to further take into account in its assessment for the resolution on the two countries, because these two situations and other situations in the region and beyond are further worsening. As you visited the area, as you were on the ground, Amina Mohammed was also addressing the situation. We also are aware of the fact that the new head of the DPKO, Mr. Lacroix, was also present in the area. My observations are as follows. The humanitarian aspect is fundamental. It is critical to rescue people and to save lives. However, wanting to do something does not mean one can do something. You mentioned that there have been a number of pledges for contributions to assist those countries. There were other African countries, including with other countries in the south, including Somalia, and the list does go on. But ultimately, very little money was set aside. We are in the second half of 2017. So is the issue of making funds available to enable you to take action. The second observation and second issue I would like to flag is as follows. Even if these funds are allocated, then how is it possible materially on the ground, how can assistance be delivered to all those people with the assistance of other countries? The security situation simply prevents this, and the hotbeds of tension are multiplying. So our observation of the situation from Senegal is how can the international community, beginning with the United Nations, how can it be in a position to act together in an orderly and coordinated manner? Because the Undersecretary General, yourself, and the DPKO, the question is, were these visits planified and coordinated? And at the same time, I am aware of the fact that the chair of the Central African Configuration of Peacebuilding Commission also visited the area, conducted a visit to the ground. So I'm also aware that my Ukrainian colleague, who chairs the Sanctions Committee on the Central African Republic, also visited the area. So there are a great number of visits. So what brings all of these visits together? What is the thread that brings them together for them to have the greatest impact? You also mentioned the root causes, because the humanitarian response is a response to the effects. What prompts us to do this, the analysis, the responsibility of political actors in those two countries is evident. Are there not other causes as well? The DRC and the CAR together can bring together all the people of the West. This is a vast area of territory. It's also a rich territory. All sorts of natural resources are located there. However, we are aware of the fact that as we speak, these clashes are unfolding, a great deal of the natural wealth of the country is being exploited. So my observation is as follows. Who are these entities, these individuals, these multinational companies who are exploiting those resources as the crisis is worsening? The political, the security, and the humanitarian crisis is worsening. As regards human rights, there are the guiding principles for upholding protection and promotion of human rights. There is the social responsibility of the private sector throughout the world, but especially in those countries, there's that responsibility. Perhaps in the analysis we should incorporate the contribution of the business sector and the private sector in putting forth the necessary funds to deliver assistance to those people. The last element I would like to flag, the United Nations, the General Assembly, and the Security Council in April 2016 adopted a document for the United Nations system to now act in a continuous manner, in a continuum, including the humanitarian aspect, including the development aspect, and the development and addressing root causes, as the Secretary General Antonio Guterres seeks to put forward those proposals for United Nations reform. Perhaps as you are stepping down, Mr. O'Brien, perhaps there will be proposals in this regard. They would be welcome for the United Nations to finally begin to act in a truly collective manner. One act, one United Nations. So long as this is not done, and so long as private businesses which exploit the resources of these countries are not addressed, I strongly fear that we will be unable to make considerable headway in addressing the crisis. So that is what I wish to note, while recalling the fact that my country is firmly committed to those countries as a troop contributing country in the Central African Republic. A Senegalese general is a force commander. We constantly organize meetings on TCCs, on troop contributing countries, to consider the ways in which, in this context of dwindling resources, the ways that the mission on the ground, the missions can be better restructured to provide a greater impact in terms of mobility, in terms of equipment, in terms of technology as well. We're also present in the DRC. Senegal's contribution is not yet financial. We are not yet wealthy to that degree, even though there's a lot of gas and oil on the Senegalese coast. But this is a commitment, a political commitment, to contribute to the advocacy, to your advocacy for the international community, not to throw in the towel, not to make that error, not to reduce its commitment vis-a-vis those two countries, as well as vis-a-vis the other areas. I'm referring to South Sudan, I'm referring to Somalia, I'm referring to West Africa in general, the situation in Mali. So there's an upsurge, as the Undersecretary General mentioned. Now is not the time to throw in the towel. So once again, thank you very much for your commitment. And we wish you the very best in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now let's have a show. Who would like to contribute? So I think the United States. I'm rather hoping for a bigger clamour of hands than that. Thank you very much. I can't quite see. United Kingdom. Excellent. Yes, of course. Excellent. So to the United States.
Sure. First of all, just thank you.
Sorry? EU. Very good. Right. We'll take that now to US, UK, EU in that order.
First of all, thank you very much for this morning's briefing, as well as to the permanent representatives of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Central African Republic for your remarks and contribution. When I first joined USAID about 6 years ago, my first trip abroad on behalf of our government was to the Central African Republic, and my second trip was to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And at the time, I was really struck by how much potential and opportunity and progress had been made in both contexts, but acutely aware of the challenges. So it's particularly compelling to see the extent to which those challenges have only grown and exacerbated in this time, and the need and urgency of efforts to really double down on progress and opportunity, and to make sure that we're mounting a correspondingly robust response on all fronts, development, humanitarian, and political, as we look to a worsening and more grave situation in both contexts. Duly noted on your interest in matching funds. I'll take that back to Washington and see what we can do. But I am acutely aware that the SURF is also critically low in terms of the funding. We this year did increase our contribution. We nearly doubled our contribution, and I would encourage member states in our position to do so, to consider contributions directly to needs on the ground in CAR or DRC, but also to consider the value and impact of a direct contribution to SURF, given the important role that it plays in this in contexts such as these. Duly noted as well on the important role of peacekeeping operations in both contexts. And I would just like to ask two follow-up questions. I think the first is we're looking at an incredibly long litany of grave and compelling responses, certainly those that are in front of us daily, like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, South Sudan, Nigeria, but really acute needs in places like CAR and DRC. What we might do to ensure that those that don't get daily attention still get the attention that they deserve on the humanitarian and the political fronts. And secondly, one of the primary purposes of our being here, particularly as a member of the Security Council, is on the political piece. And our engagement here in New York is heavily defined by that. And I'd just be interested in knowing what your top 2 or 3 asks of political actors here are coming off of this trip. Thank you.
Sorry, UK, thanks.
Oh, okay, it's working, thanks. I should probably let the EU go first in this pre-Brexit era, but my name's Caroline Vent. I'm at the UK mission here covering humanitarian affairs. Thank you very much for your briefing. I mean, the UK really shares the concerns that have been outlined today regarding the humanitarian situation in both the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Central African Republic. And we're a donor to both appeals, and we'll certainly be seeing what more we can do. And on that, your announcement about the SURF being on a match basis is very welcome. My question relates to DRC. The first thing to say is that we were very concerned by the findings of the OHCHR report last week. And certainly the links between the sort of the political and the human rights and humanitarian situation are very clear. My question relates to food security in DRC. I noticed that there had been a 30% jump in the number of food insecure households over the past 8 months, and now 42% of all households are food insecure, which is largely due, as you've said, to the new area of conflict in the Kasais. For those of you who are not aware, a Security Council PRST has just passed silence procedure today and will be adopted in the coming days on the 4 so-called famine situations in northeast Nigeria, Yemen, Somalia and South Sudan. And that calls on the UN to systematically provide early warning on man-made famines, that is famine related to conflict. And I just wanted to ask your opinion, Mr. O'Brien, is there a risk that DRC is the next situation in that respect?
Thank you very much indeed to the UK, to the EU.
Thank you very much. I think we are fully aligned, the UK and the European Commission. I want to start by thanking Madame l'Ambassadrice, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, pour votre intervention. I would like to express our deep concern about the resurgence of violence and therefore the increase of suffering in the region. We are deeply engaged with your people and supporting every effort to address humanitarian suffering. I also fully agree with the ambassador from Senegal in the sense that this is a regional crisis and it should be approached as such. We welcomed your visit, Undersecretary General. It's a very significant choice that you made as last visit, and because we don't hear enough from this region, and we think that this is a very welcome effort to raise the awareness on this. Since I'm here, we haven't heard so much from CARD and from DRC, really little. I think that the donors can help on this. We, as the European Commission, are ready to advocate more. I think that it would be helpful that we could participate in humanitarian country team to play together and to be more stronger. The European Commission has recently released 5 additional million euros for the Kasai region. And since the beginning of this year, the European Commission has released 20 million in the Central African Republic for humanitarian needs. We also consider it very important to invest in resilience and we have the European Union Trust Fund, BECU, investing in this regard. And I'm curious to know, what is your assessment now that we are talking about the new way of working, on which opportunities for investing in resilience and recovery have you seen in your visit? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody else? I'll try and perhaps give a few reactions to some of the questions being raised, and that might prompt some more questions, and certainly draw in any comments from my fellow panelists. In just going back to the very comprehensive and welcome contribution from the distinguished representative of Senegal, and thank you very much indeed for being so fulsome in your analysis and your support. I do think it's very important to recognize the regional dimension. When we say that, there's always concern that somehow that will diminish the focus on a particular country when it comes to attracting funding, because immediately you put it out into a regional context, it then diffuses the where people are placing their financial support. But I think the point about the regional dimension is just how political that is. And we are dealing in both countries with man-made, politically generated humanitarian crises. That's not to put the blame all on those who are in formal political positions. It's obviously a combination of a whole range of people from various parts of each country not finding a way forward that is either peaceful or democratic, which is creating more and more uncertainty and insecurity and putting massive pressure on supply lines and normal economic and agricultural activity, which is then leading to these humanitarian needs as well as the protection crisis. But the regional dimension is one, of course, where you get people flowing across borders. You increase the amount of insecurity, and we can see that with the 30,000 that we know about who've gone from DRC into Angola. We have to recognize that quite a number of people have been going in and out of different countries. And CAR, the regional dimension I'm particularly concerned about, is not the continuing pressure alone on Cameroon, for instance, in the eastern part, where in the 3 départements on the eastern part of Cameroon, we've got something like 274,000 people who are still there from having fled from CAR and not yet returned. But there's an increasing amount of pressure now on southern Chad, where we don't want to find that there's an increased instability there, given we already have very severe instability from South Sudan, with Uganda now having taken so many refugees. There's a likely spill further westwards from South Sudan, which is going to put additional pressure both on Chad and potentially on CAR, and then further south towards the Democratic Republic of Congo. There is the continuing pressure of people either wanting to go through, into, or around Rwanda, given that Burundi itself is not in a very strong or stable position as we speak. So put that together, the regional dimension is very severe. It does mean, and I think it was really helpful for the Senegalese representative to raise this point, of course, it's the facts on the ground have changed and gone sufficiently different in terms of violence and atrocity that has no doubt prompted so many of us, when we're looking at all the various issues around the world, to think how much more attention and priority we need to give to these two countries. So it was no coincidence that the Deputy Secretary General was there, particularly focused on women's affairs and women's rights. My equivalent in the DPKO was clearly concerned about the mission in both countries, and is making sure the focus remains on, notwithstanding the very grave budgetary pressures on the peacekeeping, how to maintain a case for increase where the facts on the ground justify it, and the need is there. And I was, when I was there, I put on the public record that from what I could see, although it's beyond my humanitarian brief, what I could see, I thought there was a very good case to recognize that this would be a moment where, in normal circumstances, you would seek to increase the amount of capacity that you had in those two missions for those two countries, given the facts on the ground as they have developed over recent weeks and months. And the reason I say all that is because I think it was a very, very important point that was made, that, of course, these are regions of the continent of Africa, of the 54 countries in Africa. So the AU, of course, has a very direct and important role, and it's very important we as the international community and as the United Nations work very closely and in close coordination with the AU. So all these visits were a natural coincidence. They naturally, therefore, become coordinated. I'm not going to say that we orchestrated them. We didn't. They are a natural reflection of the concerns. And it is also to recognize that we need funds. Yes, that's the essential message. But we need to be tackling the root causes at the same time as we are dealing with meeting the immediate needs of the suffering of people as a result of these situations, and also for the protection of people caught up in the crisis. A point on that, apart from the fact that I think you raised the question about if we get the money, how do we distribute? Have we got the capacity? To which the answer is, in the areas where we have already been established, we have a proven track record that we are already reaching millions of people. I can't prove this, and it's the same wherever the humanitarians are acting. But I just ask you to imagine what the situation would be like if the UN was not currently where it is, not currently doing its job, not reaching the millions of people it is reaching today and tonight. Just how much worse a situation we'd be in. The trouble is the facts have developed in a way which means that we're not there sufficiently, and that's why we need both more money and to use the track that we have already developed in the various ways of reaching people. But where it becomes very difficult and timely is where we are suddenly faced with a new area or region of activity. Now, the Kasais is no longer quite new, but it's certainly recent in terms of its development of need. And that's what's taking us, I hope we're doing it very urgently, and from what I'm seeing, I'm getting very good reports that the capacity build-up is working well, and we're seeking to work with local authorities in the Kasais. But it does take time because the logistics in the DRC are very, very challenging. And the real costs come up front. The establishment costs are always front-loaded. And that's why when an appeal is only a quarter funded, and we're well beyond halfway through the year, it's very difficult for not just INGOs and NGOs, but clearly the UN funds programs and agencies who have responsibilities to take the risk of funding when they don't know the money has come in. And that's why we have to call now for the appeal to be filled so that we can make sure those establishment costs can be put in place, and that gets the logistics and the supply chains in place. Because it then goes to 2 points. The first was something which I think you mentioned again, and that is, which I didn't cover in my opening remarks, and that is both in the CAR and in the DRC, and we've known this about the Kivus for a very long time anyway in the DRC, is that this is so often not just a political issue, but a fight for these very valuable mineral resources which are plentiful in both countries. But whilst unquestionably there are supply chains which are getting through to, as was put by the Senegalese representative, the multinationals, what is most obvious to the eye when you're visiting these dangerous areas, and you're obviously, as somebody like myself, being well protected, as we should be and are, but nonetheless you get to see for yourself, you go to a village in the eastern Kivus, and that morning that hill was controlled by that militia, and by the afternoon it's controlled by another militia, but in it there is this, particularly the mineral, bauxite or something, which is so valuable to the international markets, but it's artisanal extraction, and it's further down the chain that it reaches the multinational markets. So there is a disconnect between the activity and the control of extracting the mineral on the ground through artisanal activity versus the actual multinational markets to which you were referring, and the difficulty, therefore, of making an equivalence between that on the ground and what's causing so many of the conflicts to have control of those valuable cash flows and resources versus the potential for any argument, which you were also highlighting, about exploitation and what should be done about the shared responsibility of those in large commercial operations. I think that's rather difficult for us to unravel at the same time as we're trying to simply meet immediate needs of the suffering of the people, which is why we call for the funds to the well-devised common programs of the humanitarian response funds and plans, and which is why that's the most efficient way to do it, and supported, I hope, as the United States made a very good plea on my behalf for the SURF, through the SURF as well. But it also goes to the question about, which the United States asked, about the, I'm sorry, I think it was the UK asked about food security. Because in both countries, these are very verdant areas. There's nothing, there's no desert-like conditions. These are incredibly fertile. And so it seems, it defies the imagination as to how it's not possible to grow the food. But the trouble is, of course, in violence and in unpredictable, really unpredictable conditions where you have militias under nobody's control and could change in any moment, are rampaging through villages and often using either for as a reality or an excuse, either an ethnic or a confessional identity, and therefore picking out those in a discriminatory way going through the villages. It means that people don't sow the seeds for next season. They don't. So the question about using, which the EU raised, about how much is therefore available for under a sort of development and early recovery, a resilience program. I mean, all of us, particularly following the decisions made at the World Humanitarian Summit, are passionately keen to see more of the humanitarian development nexus put into reality on the ground, and there's a deep commitment to that. But actually saying that the funding that I'm calling for is going to resilience, frankly, is a stretch when you're dealing with such terrible conflict conditions of unpredictability. And it's not just where it is today, it's the fact that now in both CAR, where we've seen it in 3 areas, in the southeast, which is very recent compared to some in the east, some in the northwest, and in previous times around Bangui, in the DRC, where suddenly the Kasais, and now in the new region of Tanganyika, carved out of the old Katanga region on Lake Tanganyika, suddenly areas which have not seen upsurges in violence are coming up. Of course, everybody else in the other parts of the country are worried about when is it their turn for these militias to rampage through. So that is what undercuts the supply of the normal seasonal growing of people being able to supply themselves. And that's part of the reason why we have to meet this with an emergency approach. And then once there is a political stabilization, then that will give the opportunity for a better resilience opportunity, which the EU urged and raised. And so just dealing with the other point that I think the US made, and I was very grateful to your use of the expression double down. I think that's exactly what's required now. We all need to double down on both CAR and DRC for this robust response. But I do think that in addition to the reasons that both myself and others from the UN family have been putting a big focus on these 2 countries over recent weeks, I think the way to keep this going is there has to be a commitment to advocacy for these countries. I'm always, to be frank, I'm somewhat allergic to the idea that one has to make comparisons around the world as to where is the most terrible humanitarian emergency. Clearly, we have a lot of focus in Syria. There's been a lot of recent focus in Iraq because of the Mosul operation. We're seeing continuing reports now of very, very grave concern in Afghanistan and the Pakistan border, as well as the north of Afghanistan, continuing concerns in Myanmar, in Ukraine, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and of course in Haiti and many others that have been affected by either El Nino or the post-El Nino concerns. But the big areas that are of great focus in the continent of Africa remain the 4 threatened famines, which were mentioned, plus DRC and CAR. But I hope that would not be to completely ignore that we've got big challenges, for instance, in Madagascar, in parts of Mozambique, all of which need to be addressed, in Malawi. But I'm just going to conclude my remarks by welcoming the fact that there is this new approach, which I think it was the UK mentioned, that the silence procedure has just been completed on how do we get a better alert mechanism for threatened famine, so that we can act early enough. So it goes back to the decision that was made back in January this year, when we could see from the clues, not proven evidence, the clues of approaching famine from the FuseNet and other data. So we took what seemed at the time like a very high-risk decision, and the Secretary General supported that and came out himself urging the world to take attention to the 4 threatened famines, because we could do something about it before they became real famines. The result is that, yes, funding has been raised. It's still not enough, but sufficient has been raised for us to keep going and getting in there, so that, I mean, it's a good example as to why this is important on CAR and DRC, because if acting early enough to alert everybody means that we can repeat where we are with the 4 threatened famines, is they remain threatened. They haven't become famines. And that means that, yes, we have kept people out of level 5, and there were 1 million in level 4 before we made the appeal. Now, it so happens that we are reaching the point where 1.7 million people are in level 4, but none are in level 5. And even in the 2 parts of South Sudan where we had famine, they've now been lifted out. The trouble is, of course, as the conditions of drought in those circumstances and man-made conflict continue to put pressure, more people are coming into risk, although we've lifted people out of the catastrophe. So it's been successful as a strategic approach to act early, but it means that a lot more yet has to be done in order to take people back up the scale through level 4 to level 3, level 2, so you start getting this absence of the threat. At the moment, we've held it into the threat rather than becoming a famine, so that is strategically a relative success, but it doesn't mean that if you are living in the Somali region of Ethiopia or Somalia, just away from the coast, or even in northeastern Kenya, let alone in northeastern Nigeria, in South Sudan, or above all Yemen, that you're anywhere out of danger yet, but you're certainly not actually subjected to famine, other than in pockets that are below the measurable lines. So I think that's welcome, and if you like, this approach to CAR and DRC is in the same vein as trying to give you an alert, so that it gives you a chance to consult with capitals, to get a strategic approach to where best to place the very precious public money, because the scale which we are dealing with, it requires, in the end, public money. However much these wonderful INGOs and NGOs are funded, they can never be funded to the same scale as the UN and the large agencies are able to fund for this scale of approach, which we need for these 2 countries as well as the others. So by that answer, I hope I've avoided putting any relative scorecard as to humanitarian need, but to recognize that this is all about pace, scale and pace, and for that we need your precious money, and we are grateful and hope for more will come. I should just find out if there are either of my compatriots here who would like to add anything, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire.
Thank you, Mr. Undersecretary General. I just wanted to thank those delegates that have taken the floor and everyone else in attendance. You have said everything, especially with respect to the appeal that you have launched for contributions. It's for the people who are suffering. It's for a suffering country. We need your support and your action from everyone so that we can help these people to survive. In our country, we can't talk about a food crisis per se. We have always lived off the abundance of our crops. But what is happening now is that people have had to abandon everything and to seek, in some cases, refuge not too far from where they live, which means that they need everything, whereas before that they had everything and they grew whatever crops they needed and they were able to sell the surplus of their crops. But if we're now talking about food crisis and even a humanitarian crisis, it's really because these people have been displaced. We have people who are now seeking refuge elsewhere and have abandoned their fields, their homes, and everything. And it is for this reason, Mr. USG, that I couldn't put it any better than you have. We must come to the aid of these people by affording OCHA whatever resources they need to curb this crisis. Thank you.
Merci, thank you.
I think that if there is a remark to deliver, that would be that the Undersecretary General is in a position to speak with authority about the humanitarian situation. I fully align myself with his remarks. As the ambassador of Senegal mentioned, and as our colleague from the Central African Republic echoed, we find ourselves facing people who are no longer living in their countries due to the situation plaguing their countries. They are now displaced persons. They are in other areas where they can no longer meet their own needs. As a result, they are dependent upon other people who need to provide them with assistance. So you can imagine the difficulties faced by great numbers of people. It is very difficult, even though these people just yesterday they lived off of agriculture, it is still difficult for them to continue to cultivate anything. So it is, as was the Secretary General mentioned, with the advocacy for these people, it is normal for us to approach you and to request assistance, your assistance for our people. The humanitarian situation, as was just mentioned by the Undersecretary General in the Kasai, is due to the conflict plaguing the region. In the eastern DRC, as was just mentioned, this situation is present. I always read the United Nations reports drafted by MINUSCO, and each report drawn up by MINUSCO, there is a chapter dedicated to the humanitarian situation. And we always revisit those issues. We always address them. But this time, in the Kasai region, the situation is exacerbated by the conflict plaguing the area. And these conflicts are causing people to flee, to seek security. They seek refuge elsewhere. And when they seek refuge elsewhere, they don't travel with their belongings. And where they live, if there is war, everything is destroyed. So nothing is left. For this reason, as the Undersecretary General mentioned, we would emphasize the importance of your assistance now, as was mentioned. Because if we have to wait for later, the crisis is liable to further worsen. And then there will be a need for even more resources to meet the shifting nature of the current crisis. So we would request of you that you advocate this cause amongst your governments for them to assist our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other contributions or points that anybody wants to make? I mean, I would just, if I may, conclude. I think the message of this meeting is clear. There's a big appeal for resources to support meeting the immediate humanitarian needs of millions of people who are suffering in these two countries as a result of a really nasty spike, upsurge in violence, which has led to a high degree of unpredictability. But I think it would be wrong to leave this meeting without mentioning, which I think the US made the point. This is not a way of, as it were, deflecting or distracting ourselves from the fundamental root causes, which needs to be that we must look to the responsibility of governments and to politicians and to the international community through its political processes, be that at the Security Council and elsewhere, that ultimately the violence which is driving so much of the humanitarian need will be brought to an end because there is a sense of political resolution, a commitment to peace, and above all, a sense of engagement. Part of the challenge I observed in both countries, where obviously very, very large countries, but populations which are sparse because of the nature of the size of the country. It's about, what, 4.5 million in CAR, and it's about 80 million in DRC, I think. But when you look at the size of the country, inevitably this is quite sparse with some concentrations of population. But if the government's writ in a democratic and accountable, transparent, uncorrupt way can extend to villages and towns, even though the communications are difficult, then of course there's a feeling of engagement. The difficulty comes when there is this sense of the government's ability to reach not being in place, and that then leaves a vacuum which are very rapidly filled by those either contesting for these mineral resources to get cash flows, which they want to be able to control, and some it's about power politics, and increasingly once there is a taste for this ability to contest for local power, it can very rapidly descend into ethnic and confessional dimensions. So these are very normal discussions that are had here at the UN, but they are having an immediate effect upon the countless people in both CAR and DRC. And it's those immediate needs that we're seeking to address, and that's what the resources need to be used for, at the same time as we need to put a big burden and responsibility of expectation on to those who need to find their way forward for political solutions which will help the sense of engagement and therefore this absence of alienation. So I would urge that, because both of these are not, and I think it was very helpful the UK raised this point, it's not about the fact that these are countries which are not able normally to feed themselves. It's the fact the circumstances are led to them being unable to have supply chains and predictability. So you can't even really have a sensible resilience agenda until you get to the point of security that people can actually go back to their fields and sow. And so this is primarily about IDPs and protection. And just to give you an example, one of the IDPs, she was a mother of 8 children, Amina, who I met, and she was literally with 4 bamboo poles under the old mosquito net that she'd been able to bring from her home, which she had been firebombed out of the IDP site that we had built. That was then erased because it was completely firebombed by an unidentified group, and people, of course, made lots of accusations and identified them, but without proof we can't say. But so she was in the school grounds in the Kasai region, and there were 4 bamboo poles with this mosquito net tent over, and that's where she and her 8 children were surviving on just the school grounds, dust and sand. So of course nothing can grow. Totally dependent for water, for protection, for food on anybody who might pass. And until the international community is able to access it, to register, then of course even the international community is not able to do that. MSF were able to produce some health, and the UN was producing some food and water, but a lot would need to be done, and that will not sort itself out very quickly. It takes time for somebody to have the confidence to be able to go back to their home in due course. So that is where the resources are needed, because that, Amina, she wasn't the cause of any of this. She's just caught up in it, and that's what we're about. So I do want to put the emphasis back on that the solution will come because there is a political solution, but in the meantime, we have an obligation to meet the immediate needs, and so the appeal is there. So I hope that gives you enough data and conviction to write extremely powerful and persuasive reports back to your capitals, and to unlock the money from your treasuries so that we can actually fill up these appeals and go through a coordinated and well-framed strategic plan that will meet these immediate needs. But in the meantime, may I thank the distinguished PRs from both the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and indeed to your colleagues for hosting my visits, which were both disturbing but extremely well arranged, and I'm very grateful to you. And I was very grateful to have access to people at the highest levels as well as at the local level, and indeed had a couple of meetings with your president, and I was very grateful. There's a will, there's a commitment to address the issues, but at the moment there is a capacity problem in all respects. So thank you very much indeed. We finished unusually before time, but only just. And thank you all for your attention, and above all for your support. And I very much look forward to delivering on my promise to do something with the SURF to match your funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.